Karl Marx, Learning Outcome 3. Team members: Emiliano Ortiz Ramírez, Iker Santiago Navas Van Prat, Alejandro Arruti Pérez, Jorge Manuel Hernández Holz. Karl Marx, brief biography. He was born in Prussia on May 5, 1818. Karl Heinrich Marx was one of 9 children born to Heinrich and Henrietta Marx in Trier, Prussia. Karl Marx was an average student. He was educated at home until he was 12 and spent 5 years, from 1830 to 1835, at a Jesuit high school in Trier, at the time known as Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium. In October of 1835, Marx began his studies at the University of Bonn. In his 2 semesters there, he was imprisoned for drunkenness and disturbing the peace, incurred debts, and participated in a duel. By the end of the year, Marx's father insisted he enroll in the more serious University of Berlin. In Berlin, he studied law and philosophy and was introduced to the philosophy of G. W. F. Hegel, who had been professor at Berlin until his death in 1831. In 1836, as he was becoming more politically zealous, Marx was secretly engaged to Jenny von Wesperen, a sought-after woman from a respected family in Trier, whose 4 years his senior. This, along with his increasing radicalism, caused his father against. In a series of letters, Marx's father expressed concerns about what he saw as his son's demons. Marx did not settle down. He received his doctorate from the University of Jena in 1841, but his radical politics prevented him from producing a teaching position. He began to work as a journalist in 1842. He became the editor of Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper in Cologne. 1 year later, the government ordered the newspaper's suspension in April 1, 1883. Marx resigned on March 18th. 3 months later, in June, he finally married Jenny von Westphalen, and in October he moved to Paris. There, along with Arnold Ruge, Marx founded a political journal titled the Tisch-Jammelchair. Only a single issue was published before philosophical differences between Marx and Ruge resulted its demise, but in August 1844 the journal brought Marx together with a contributor, Friedrich Engels, who would become his collaborator and lifelong friend. Together, the two men wrote a criticism of the philosophy of Bruno Bauer, a young Hegelian and former friend of Marx. The result of Marx and Engels' first collaboration was published in 1845 as The Holy Family. Later that year, Marx moved to Belgium after being expelled from France while writing another radical newspaper, Barwarts, which had strong ties to an organization that would later become a communist league. In Brussels, Marx was introduced to socialism by Moses Hess and finally broke off from the philosophy of young Hellenism completely. While there, he wrote The German Ideology, in which he first developed his theory on historical materialism. Marx couldn't find a willing publisher. However, The German Ideology, along with Theses of Rembrandt, which was also written during this time, were not published until after his death. At the beginning of 1846, Marx founded a communist correspondence committee in an attempt to link socialists from around Europe. The socialists in England were inspired by his ideas, and he formed the Communist League. In 1837, a central committee meeting in London, Marx and Engels were asked to write the Manifest of Communist Party. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, and shortly after, in 1849, Marx was expelled from Belgium. Then he went to France, anticipating a social revolution, but was deported from there as well. Prussia refused to re-enter him, so Marx moved to London. Britain demanded him his citizenship, but he remained in London until his death. In London, Marx helped found the German Workers' Educational Society as well as the new headquarters for the Communist League. He continued to work as a journalist, including a 10-year stint as a correspondent of the New York Daily Tribune from 1852 to 1862, but he never earned a living wage and was largely supported by Engels. Marx became increasingly focused on capitalism and economic theory, and in 1867 he published the first volume of Das Kapital. The rest of his life is spent writing and revising manuscripts for additional volumes which he did not complete. His remaining two volumes were assembled and published posthumously by Engels. Marx died of pleurisy in London on March 14, 1883, while his original grave had only a manuscript stone. The Communist Party of Great Britain erected a large tombstone including a bust of Marx in 1954. The stone is etched with the last line of the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of all lands unite," as well as quote from the thesis of Feuerbach. Historical materialism. Historical materialism is a theory proposed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx was born in Prussia in a wealthy family. His father was a lawyer. During his childhood, he was influenced by the ideas of French Revolution because his native Prussia there was feudal absolutism regnant. In there were a lot of privileges to the nobility, and in which the people, the burghers, suffered great injustices. He witnessed the exploitation and human misery during the Industrial Revolution, which workers had a 14-hour working day and didn't have a life independent of their work. That caused alienation. Alienation means the separation of things that naturally belong together, of antagonism between those who are properly in harmony. What is historical materialism? It is the doctrine that all forms of social thought, as art or philosophy, and institutions, as a family of state, develop a superstructure founded on the economic base, that they reflect the character of economic relations and are altered or modified as the result of class struggles, that each regular economic class produces a class that will destroy it to replace it, and that dialectical necessarily requires eventual withering away of the state, the establishment of classes of society, the body of theory in dialectical materialism, dealing with historical processes and causation. Manifesto of the Communist Party. In 1844, Marx met Engels. In 1848, together they published the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Marx and his author Friedrich Engels began the Communist Manifesto with the famous and provocative statement that history, all existing sciences, is the history of class struggle. They argue that all changes in the shape of society, in our political institutions, in history itself, are driven by process of collective struggle on part of groups of people with similar economic situations in order to realize the material or economic interests. These struggles occurring through the history from ancient Rome through the Middle Ages of the present days have been struggles of economically subordinate classes against economically dominant classes who opposed their economic interests, slaves against masters, serfs against landlords, and so on. The modern industrialized world has been shaped by one such subordinate class, the merchant class, in its struggle against the aristocratic elite of feudal society through the exploitation and discovery of raw materials and metals and the opening of commercial markets across the globe, of bourgeoisie, whose livelihood is accumulation of great wealth and politically involvement against the feudal order, which is eventually managed to sweep away through the struggle and revolution. The bourgeoisie have risen to the status of the dominant class in the modern industrial world, shaping political institutions and subordinate class. Now dominant has replaced one class struggle with another. The bourgeoisie is the most spectacular force in the history to date. The American zeal for accumulations had led them to conquer the world, forcing everyone everywhere to adopt the capitalist mode of production. The bourgeois view, which sees the world as one big market for exchange, has fundamentally altered all aspects of society, even the family, destroying traditional ways of life and rural civilizations and creating enormous cities in their place. Under industrialization, the means of production and exchange that drive this process, expansion and change have created a new subordinate urban class whose fate is vitality to that of the bourgeoisie. This class is the institutional proletariat or modern working class. These workers have been uprooted by the expansion of capitalism and forced to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie, a fact that offends them to the core of their existence, as they recall those workers of earlier ages who owned and sold what they created. Modern industrial workers are exploited by the bourgeoisie and forced to compete with another for ever-shrinking ways as the means of production grow more sophisticated. The factory is the arena for the formation of class struggle that will spill over into society at large. Modern instrumental workers will come to recognize their exploitations at the hands of the bourgeoisie, although the economic system forces them to compete with one another for even shrinking wage through common association on factory floor. They will overcome the divisions between themselves, realize the common fate, and begin to engage in a collective effort to protect their economic interests against the bourgeoisie. The workers will form collectivities and gradually take their demands to the political sphere as a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, the workers will be joined an ever-increasing number of the lower middle class whose interrupted livelihoods are being destroyed by the growth of the huge factories who owned by the shrinking number of superrich industrial elites. Gradually, all of society will be drawn to one or the other side of the struggle, like the bourgeoisie before them. The proletariat and their allies will act together in the interest of realizing their economic aims. They will move to sweep aside the bourgeoisie and its institutions, which stand in the way of the realization of the bourgeoisie through the established mode of production produces the seeds of its own destruction, the working class. Conclusion of the Manifesto Communist Party. The Communist Manifesto was intended as a definite programming statement of the Communist League, a German revolutionary group of which Marx and Engels were the leaders. The two men published their chart in February 1848, just months before just much of Europe was to erupt in a social and political turmoil, and the manifesto reflects the political climate of the period. In the summer of the year, youthful revolutionary groups, along with the urban disposed, set up barricades in many of Europe's capitals, fighting for a new end to political and economic oppression. While these in turn had been waging war against absolutism and aristocratic privilege since the French Revolution, many of the new radicals of 1848 had set their sights on a new enemy that they believed to be responsible for social instability and the growth of an impoverished urban underclass. That enemy was capitalism, the system of private ownership of the means of production. The manifesto describes how capitalism divides society into two classes, the bourgeoisie and the capitalists who own the means of production, and the workers who sell their labor power to the capitalists who pay the workers as little as they can to get away with. Although the Communist League was itself apparently too disconcerted to contribute much to the 1848 uprisings, the Communist Manifesto is a call of political action containing the famous command, "Workers or Workers of the World Unite." But Marx and Engels also used the book to spell out some of the basic truths as they saw it about how the world works. In the Communist Manifesto, see early versions of essential Marxist concepts that Marx would elaborate with more scientific rigor in mature writings such as Das Kapital. Perhaps most important of these concepts is the theory of historical materialism, which states that historical change is driven by collective actors attempting to realize their economic aims, resulting in class struggles in which one economic and political order is replaced by another. One of the central tenets of this theory is that social relationships and political alliances from the around of relation of production depend on a given society mode of production or for the specific economic organization of ownership and division of labor. A person's actions, attitudes, and outlook on society and his politics, loyalties, and sense of collective belonging, and all derive from his location in the relations of production. History engaged people as political actors whose identities are constituted as exploited or exploited, who form alliances with others likewise identified and who act based on these identities. Realistic philosophy. Marx was a tough critic of what's around him and concluded that idealist philosophy, which prevailed at the time, needed changes. He sought a philosophy that focused on the study of social reality, that is, that the life of people, the development and transformation is materialistic philosophy. Dialectic materialism. Historical materialism is based on the way people live and how they relate to each other. It also states that nature and society are constantly moving on. You can apply the method called dialectical materialism to understand the constant conditions and the way society moves and human thought. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels applied the dialectical materialism to study the historical process of man. As a result, concluded that social classes are the result of production level. This means that according to our man is organized to carry out production is how they generate social classes. For example, from nation farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, artisans, warriors, priests, and others. These social classes are repeated and determined by each individual participation in society. A clear example of this is the Indian society, which even today is determined by castes. Each caste has its own motion and shall exercise all his life. Dialectical materialism, official philosophy of communism based on the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, as elaborated by G. V. Plekhanov, V. I. Lenin, and Joseph Stalin. In theory, dialectical materialism is meant to provide both general world view and specific method of the investigation of scientific problems. The basic tenets that are everything is material and that the change takes place through the struggle of opposites, because everything contains different elements that are in position. Self-movement automatically occurs. The conflict of opposing forces leads to growth, change, and development according to defined laws. Communist scientists are expected to fit their investigations into the pattern. An official approval to scientific theories in the USSR was determined to some extent by their conformity to dialectical materialism. Use of the principles in history and sociology is sometimes called historical materialism. Under these doctrines, the social, political, and intellectual life of society reflect only the economic structure, since human beings create the forms of social life slowly. In response to economic needs, men are divided into classes by the relations to the means of production, land and capital. The class that controls the means of production inevitably exploits the other classes into society. This class struggle that produces the dynamic of history and is source of progress toward a final uniformity. Historical materialism is deterministic, that is, it prescribes that history inevitably follows certain laws and that individuals have little or no influence on its development. Central to historical materialism is his belief that change takes place through the meeting of two opposing forces. Their opposition is resolved by combination produced by higher force. Historical materialism has had many advocates outside the communist world. Class struggle. He establishes that society built since in quantity have been based on in quantity. The existence of social classes, which has been a struggle between the privileged and poor classes, called class struggle. Marx analyzes continually centers on how the relationship between men are shaped by their relative positions in regard to the means of production, that is, by their differential access to scarce resources of scarce power. He notes that the unequal access need not at all times and under all conditions lead to active class struggle, but he considered it axiomatic that the potential for class conflict is inherent in every different society, since such a society systematically generates conflicts of interest between persons, groups, and different located within the society struggle, and more particularly in relation to the means of production. Marx was concerned with the ways in which specific positions in the social structure tended to shape the social experiences of the incumbents and to predispose them to actions oriented to the improvement of collective fate. To Marx, the basis upon which satisfaction systems rest is the relation of aggregates to men to means of production. The major modern classes are the owners merely labor power under the capital and landowners, whose representative sources of income are wage, profit, and ground rent. Classes are gradations of persons who perform the same function in organization of production, yet self-conscious classes, as distinct from aggregates of people sharing a common fate, need for the emergence a number of conditions, among which are a network of communication, the concentration of masses of people, and a common enemy, and some form of organization. Self-conscious classes arise and only if and when there exists a convergence of what Max Weber later called ideal and material interests. That is, the combination of economic and political demands with moral and ideological quests. The classical economics picture of economic system of a market economy as one in which man working in his own interest and so slowly concerned with the maximization of his own gains, nevertheless contributes to the interests and the harmony of the whole, differing sharply, Marx contended, as Raymond Aron has put it. The each man working in his own interest contributes both of the necessary functioning and to the final destruction of the reigning. In contrast to the utilitarians who conceive of self-interest as a regulation of a hemier society, Marx sees individual self-interest among capitalists as destructive of their class interest in general, and has leading to the ultimate self-destruction of capitalism. The very fact that each capitalist acts rationally in his own self-interests leads to ever-dependent on economic crisis and hence to the destruction of interest common to all. Types of society. Marx made a classification of types of society according to what is represented as the following: ancient society based on agriculture and slavery for gaining wealth, which is only taken by a few; political system and based on conquest of for wealth; feudal system based on agricultural exploitation, relationship between the feudal form and serfs; political system based on the monarchy; capitalism, mass production of goods, exploitation of the bourgeoisie over the working class proletariat; political system based on the republic and democracy.